Yeah. Continue. Hi, folks. This is Mark Hand. I'm the GreenGov director, and I want to welcome you to the GreenGov and Penn State Sustainability Series on green buildings, green rating systems, and high performance design. I wanted to go through a few housekeeping items for all of you. You will notice that we're using a different format than we previously used. This is because we've had quite a bit of success with participants, and we have many participants, and we needed to go to a different format here. So we're shifting over to Microsoft Teams live broadcasting, and I just wanted to walk you through some of the features of Teams broadcast. So with basically on the lower left-hand corner, you have a volume control, and you can adjust volume accordingly. Also, if you need to step away briefly, you can also pause this event. And so, you can come back and unpause it and play from where you left off. And in the lower right-hand corner, you'll notice that you have closed caption option features. And then there's also, there's no live mic for question and answer in this format. So you have to put your questions in the Q&A feature. And so if it didn't show up, the Q&A, when you logged in, you want to look in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, and you'll see a question mark icon, and you can open that and ask questions throughout the course of the presentation. Please do type your questions and hit submit when you have questions that come up, and we will plan to answer your questions at the end of the presentation. Moving on, this webinar is co-hosted and supported by the GreenGov Council and Penn State Sustainability Institute. The GreenGov Council was established by Executive Order 2019-01, which requires Commonwealth agencies to lead by example, promoting energy conservation and sustainable governance. The executive order sets goals for the Commonwealth, including the goal of achieving 26% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 2025 and 80% reduction by 2050. The mission of the GreenGov Council is to encourage the incorporation of environmentally sustainable practices into the Commonwealth government's policy planning and operations, procurement and regulatory functions, and we strive for continuous improvement in efficiency and performance as we work with state agencies. A couple of items, the results of the GreenGov Council progress and agencies progress are posted on our website. GreenGov agency certification checklist is filled out by each participating agency annually, and we currently have 2019 and 2020 completed checklists on our GreenGov website. We also just this week posted the 2020 GreenGov annual report on the web, and that is a roll-up of all of our progress on goals and initiatives to date. And unfortunately, we don't have Peter joining us for this webinar. We couldn't get him on because of our technical difficulties rolling into the new format. Sorry, Peter, I know you're probably an attendee, and we'll add you the next time, but we just wanted to thank our friends at Penn State Sustainability Institute for helping us pull these sustainability series events together. And I guess with that said, I'm going to introduce our speakers, and I guess I'm going to introduce both of we have two speakers today. And so what I plan to do is introduce both, and then I'll turn the webinar over to our first speaker. And just give me 1 second. Okay, so our first speaker will be Leah Wirgau. Leah is the Education and Engagement Director at the Green Building United, where she worked with volunteers and stakeholders to identify gaps and opportunities in green building industry knowledge, developing educational offerings around sustainability standards and best practices. Leah is also an adjunct professor in the Sustainable Development Department at Thomas Jefferson University and the Sociology Department at Kalamazoo Valley Community College. She has a lead Green Associate since 2016 and as a major proponent of health and wellness became a registered yoga teacher in 2019. And then our second speaker will be Emily Starr. Emily is a senior project manager at KCI Technologies and the co-chair of U.S. Green Building Council's Central Pennsylvania Market Leadership Advisory Board. Emily has 20 years of experience as mechanical engineer in the building industry across commercial, residential, retail, healthcare, education, and government markets. She first received LEED accreditation in 2005 and has embraced sustainable design ever since. And over the past few years, she has added certified passive house consultant and WELL accredited professional to her sustainability credentials. So at this point, I'm going to send Leah over into the live. And in a minute, Leah, you should have the floor.
Yep. All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Mark. I am Leah Wirgau. As Mark said, I'm the Education and Engagement Director at Green Building United, and I am really excited to be here today with Emily Starr as co-presenter. Thank you so much to Penn State and to the GreenGov Council for inviting us to talk about green buildings today. So we're going to talk about what green buildings are, why they matter, how they pertain to Executive Order 2019-01, as well as some examples around what it means to be a green building and some of the metrics that we look at when it comes to green building and sustainability. So I'll preface this by saying, if you have any questions, like Mark said, feel free to pop those into the Q&A. We will be answering questions at the very end, but if you have something top of mind, go ahead and put that into the chat so that we can address it at the end. So just to make sure that we're all on the same page, let's take a look at Executive Order 2019-01. Now, this comes from the idea that we know that climate change is happening. We know that there are drastic impacts already happening to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, to this region, to the country, and around the world. We also know that climate change is driven predominantly by greenhouse gas emissions from man-made activities and industries. There is also a role that Pennsylvania can play in reducing those greenhouse gases. And so Executive Order 2019-01 is really focused on reducing net greenhouse gas emissions by 26% by the year 2025 and by 80% by the year 2050. And if you're looking at the calendar, 2025 is really just around the corner. So it's really important for us to start taking action right away. And these are also, I should say, from the baseline level of 2005. So it's not an arbitrary number. There is a baseline, and then we'll be making those reductions from that point. Now, within that order, if you are well versed in it, you'll know that there are a ton of strategies that are laid out that we can use to curb these greenhouse gases. These can range from energy to transportation and a few others. But one of the strategies that's specifically mentioned is around Commonwealth buildings, specifically new major renovations or built to suit leased buildings. And it specifies that they should be 10% more energy efficient above code, which is currently ASHRAE 90.1.2016. So buildings have to be 10% more efficient. And then the language goes on to say that building owners may choose to pursue standards like LEED and Green Globes, or a quote unquote comparable standard. So we'll talk a little bit about what that means in a few slides. Okay, so that sets the tone, but you might be wondering, why buildings? You know, of all of the strategies that we could use to address climate change, to reduce greenhouse gases, you know, why talk about buildings? Why talk about green buildings? So chances are you're in a building right now as you listen to this presentation. If you are fortunate enough to be outside in the sunshine watching this presentation, chances are you're still close to a building. You know, we live in buildings, we work in buildings, we go to school, we recreate, we socialize. buildings are all around us and such a part of our everyday life, it makes sense why they have a huge impact on the environment and on climate change. In fact, the majority of greenhouse gases come from the built environment. And that is because within the buildings themselves, in order to build them and operate them, we need electricity, we need heat, we need hot water. And all of these systems use energy that currently rely on non-renewable fossil fuels. So we're talking about coal, natural gas, and oil. So because of the operational load of a building, because of the embodied energy that it takes to create the building itself, the buildings themselves create a lot of greenhouse gases. And then when you want to expand that beyond just buildings to talk about the sites around the buildings and how we get to and from buildings, so transportation, that is another fossil fuel that we're using. So all encompassed, the built environment has a dramatic impact on greenhouse gases, but also a really great opportunity to reduce them, because there are a lot of strategies that we can employ to make buildings greener or more sustainable so that we have fewer greenhouse gases associated with them. And sustainability is tossed around quite a bit, but just to get us all on the same page, we really are talking about the intersection of the triple bottom line, so people, planet, profit. So we're looking to create green buildings, or buildings that are better for society, better for the environment, and better for local economies. And of course, this definition might vary depending on the community that you're working with, the building owner, or even the state. And here's just a snapshot of what we really mean by sustainability. So when we think about a traditional building that's not meeting code, that's not regarding energy or water use or materials, there are negative environmental impacts, greenhouse gas emissions being part of that. Now, when we get up to code, we're starting to address some of those negative impacts. If we go beyond code to make it green or high performing, then we're going to have even more improvement. But then if we want to look at holistic sustainability, we're talking about having net positive impact on the environment. And this graphic was pulled from the International Living Future Institute, or ILFI. And that's an organization that we're going to be talking about a little bit more later. And you might be wondering, well, what do we mean by high performance? So, the executive order mentions high performance. We talk about high performance. I've said it a few times. So we're really talking about creating efficient buildings. So when we want to address greenhouse gases, the biggest impact that the built environment can play is around energy use. So how are we making sure that buildings are performing as efficiently and highly as possible? But you might be also wondering, how do we know if a building is green, right? So a building might say, oh yeah, sure, I'm green. But how do we actually measure that? So years ago, this was the question on everyone's mind as buildings were going up and people were saying they were green. So LEED, which is a topic that Emily is going to cover in a lot more depth in a bit, came out and said, how are we measuring this? So they were one of the first tools for measuring what it means to be green. And yes, part of that is energy, but they also wanted to look at a bunch of other categories that Emily is going to cover. But LEED is no longer the only player. It's definitely one of the biggest, but we also have GreenGovs. Those are the two that were cited within the executive order. There are a number of other standards, some of which are featured here. And what we wanted to do today is talk about LEED and talk about GreenGovs, because again, those are the ones that are mentioned. But we also wanted to talk about some of those comparable standards, specifically PHIS and PHI, or Passive House, and the Living Building Challenge. And then when we're talking about energy and we're talking about buildings, it's hard to not talk about health and wellness. So especially in today's climate, with our current health crisis, we want to make sure that we're also addressing the indoor environmental quality of our buildings. So we're going to finish off the presentation later by Emily covering the well building standard. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Emily.
All right, thank you. So yeah, first I want to talk about LEED. LEED is specifically mentioned in the executive order. It's mentioned first, and it's the rating system that most people are generally familiar with. It was the first on the scene, as Leah mentioned, and it's the most widely used green building rating system in the world. It's inspiration for many of the other rating systems that were shown on that previous slide. And USGBC says LEED provides a framework for healthy, high efficient, and cost-saving green buildings. Next slide. So LEED has grown and adapted over the years. Like as we mentioned, it was one of the first. I obtained my accreditation 15 years ago, and I went to a seminar where one of the gentlemen who worked on the original standard was a speaker, and he talked about the way, well, and for anyone on this meeting who was involved with LEED in the early days, some of the credits you kind of thought they didn't make sense or they didn't kind of jive with other credits. And he said they made this for an office building, and they were hoping just one team would use it for a building. Obviously, that goal is exceeded many times over. So the rating system has been modified over the years to incorporate different building types and additional goals, and kind of to clean up some of those things that may not have made sense. So the goals associated with the current version, which is LEED version 4.1, are on the screen now. And you can see that it does exceed just energy savings or recycling. And we'll go to the next slide. So these are the rating systems available under LEED version 4.1. The purpose, so the purposes of for this presentation, we're going to focus on the building design and construction. But you can see there are other options available, for fit outs, for existing buildings that have been in operation, residential. And since we're talking about this, and since I am sitting in South Central Pennsylvania, I do want to mention that for those of you that aren't aware, Lancaster became one of the first cities in the world to earn gold certification through the LEED for Cities program, and that has happened within the last few years. We're focused on buildings for this presentation, but it was a great feat, and I wanted to mention that and celebrate that. Next slide. So for the BD plus C rating system, there's 9 categories, which are listed here. There's credits to discourage development on inappropriate sites, so to speak, whether it's due to environmental concerns, transportation needs, and others. That's located kind of under location and transportation and sustainable sites. There's credits that encourage reduction in water and energy use, whether that be through improving the building envelope to require less heating and cooling, selection of more efficient lights, plumbing fixtures and mechanical equipment. And there's other options to reduce water usage, such as choosing landscaping that does not require irrigation. The choice of building materials is critical as well, and they have credits encouraging locally sourced materials, rapidly renewables, or repurposed and recycled items. And then some of the items related to materials related to the occupant happiness are to choose materials with low VOCs, so you're not getting the off-gassing. And they're also looking now, embodied carbon is becoming a big topic. So they're encouraging the use of materials with low embodied carbon. The indoor environmental quality credit category addresses the freshness of the air, temperature, the amount of air, the type and controllability of lighting. It has acoustical considerations, and daylight in views for occupants are all wrapped up into there. So some of those are related to reducing the amount of energy, and some are related just to making it a better place for the occupants to enjoy and work or live or learn. They do have the innovation and regional priority credits, which have been included in several versions. The regional priority just gives you additional points to encourage you to focus on credits that are critical in a particular area. And for instance, if you're working in a project in the Baltimore Inner Harbor area, a lot of water credits have regional priority. So next slide. Well, I did want to mention that the certification levels for LEED begin with simply being certified. If you reach a minimum number of credits, and then you can go to silver, gold, or platinum levels based on the number of points you get above certified. Next slide. Okay, so now let's move on to the second rating system that's mentioned in the executive order, which is GreenGov's. The system was developed by the Green Building Initiative and is very similar to LEED. The terminology is different, but the overall concepts and goals are the same. Next slide. So rather than rating systems, GreenGov calls them programs, and this is the list of what they're currently offering. They're on their 2019 versions. The previous version was 2013. We're going to specifically talk about the new construction version as we did with LEED, but you can see they've got the core and shell, interiors, existing buildings, many of the same things that LEED offers. Next slide. So GreenGov calls them assessment areas. They have 6 of them, and you can see they're very similar to LEED. The goals are the same, but the approach is a little bit different. GreenGov doesn't have prerequisites, and they have 1,000 points instead of however many credits LEED has, which I don't remember off the top of my head. And they have more hands-on involvement than LEED does. There's one-on-one meetings with staff throughout the process and an on-site walkthrough with staff. So for some teams that may be a plus, over LEED. But yeah, they're very similar. And I'm going to pass it back to Leah to talk about a few additional ones.
All right, thank you so much, Emily. And yes, we're going to talk next about Passive House, which, if you're familiar with it, is all about high performance, which is the crux of the game when it comes to reducing our energy associated with our buildings and the built environment. So even though it's Passive House, you might think, well, is it just, houses? And that's not true. Passive House applies to both residential as well as commercial spaces. So you can pursue Passive House regardless of what building typology you have. Passive House came out of Europe, so it is a Germany-based standard, but it was adopted in the United States many years ago, and there are 2 main governing bodies. So Emily talked about USGBC kind of governing LEED. So in the Passive House world, there are 2. One is Passive House Institute. That's the one that came out of Europe. But then there's also a more United States, North American focused group. That's the Passive House Institute US. So if you were someone wanting to pursue a Passive House, whether that's for your home or for a commercial property, because of the technical nature of Passive House, it really is recommended that you work with a consultant. And whichever path you decide to go with, whether it's with PHI or with FIAS, will depend on the expertise of that consultant, but it also will depend on what is it that you want to pursue. Both areas are comparable. They both have their strengths. At Green Building United, we fully support the utilization of either standard under either Passive House standard under PHI or FIAS. So it really is just about preference. Here you can see one of the projects that you can find in Philadelphia by an architecture firm called Onion Flats. They work in Passive House design, and this here is one of their many projects. So there are 5 main Passive House features or principles. And it seems pretty simple, but it really is a complicated, though achievable standard. And really, if you wanted to boil it down, it's about having as tight of a building envelope as possible. So when we think about energy efficiency in a space, any type of building, energy loss comes from having poor insulation, poor materials, inadequate windows and doors. Anywhere where there's a hole or the potential to have leakage in the building envelope is where you might have that energy escape. And that's how we get energy loss. So your heating and cooling spaces that you're trying to heat a space, but if some of that energy is escaping, then that's where you end up having to use a lot more energy than you actually need. That drives up utility costs, that drives up energy usage, and that drives up greenhouse gases. So one of the tenets of this is really just to make sure that you have a tight building envelope. The first aspect, though, of passive house is taking advantage of some of those natural elements. So you might have heard about passive design, where you are really taking advantage of sunlight, whether that's the angle of the sun or certain types of seasons or other natural elements such as shading from trees or nearby infrastructure to help regulate the heating and cooling load of the building itself. So the first thing is, can you just take advantage of how you're setting the space up and also how you're orienting the space to use those components? The next two principles go hand in hand. So we have continuous insulation and airtight in construction. So that means that anytime you're having a stud or something that's connecting the inside to the outside, that is an opportunity for energy loss. So making sure that it's tightly insulated and you're not going to have that is really crucial. But then, some people think, well, if you're creating this almost vacuum effect with a building, how do people breathe? And that is where mechanical systems come into play. Passive house is really focused around proper HVAC systems. And this is really where that technical piece comes in, because you want to make sure that you're having continuous ventilation and airflow so that you're piping in fresh air from the outside to the inside so that your occupants can be healthy, well, and that they can breathe. And then the last component is having high performance windows and doors, or really just high performance materials, because if you have a great design, energy efficient, HVAC systems are set in place, but you don't have the right materials to support that, then your project might not end up pursuing or achieving passive house. And here's a really nice schematic of that, illustrating those 5 components. And before I move on to the next standard, the last thing I'll mention is that when Emily was talking about LEED and green globes, she mentioned the different point systems under the different categories, depending on which level you're pursuing. Passive house is unique in that you can't just sort of achieve passive house. You either pass or fail. So a building either becomes passive house certified or it doesn't become passive house certified. So if you are someone who's wanting to pursue it, that's why it is really important to have a consultant help you, so that as you're going through the design and construction phases, they can flag any areas that might keep you from passing that final test. It's called a blower door test, and it's really just a test to make sure that your building is performing as optimally as it is designed to. So that is passive house. Now, circling back to executive order, if you achieved passive house, green globes, LEED, that is definitely going to set you at that 10% or more energy efficient requirement when it comes to Commonwealth buildings. But what if we want to do more than just reduce energy? What if we want to make buildings better? And that is really where the Living Building Challenge comes into play. This standard was out of the formerly Cascadia chapter of U.S. Green Building Council in Seattle, Washington, now known as the International Living Future Institute, or ILFI as I'll call them. So ILFI wanted to know, could we actually make buildings better for the planet? So instead of just reducing water, reducing energy, reducing materials use, can they be net positive? And thus was born the Living Building Challenge. And their ethos behind it really was, in other elements in nature, you don't see a flower distinguished from its environment. But oftentimes, humans and our infrastructure, we differentiate ourselves from nature. So we think of ourselves as apart from nature instead of integral to nature. And when we do that, we can use it as this calculated cost, benefit, take, give scenario instead of what is impacting the environment is impacting us because we are the environment. So they really wanted to use the idea of a flower to guide what it would mean for a building to be like a flower and to be truly integrated and holistic and net positive and in balance with its environment. And they don't have different levels within LBC as much as they have different petals. So some of these look really familiar, right? With green globes and with LEED, we saw some of these categories like energy and water and materials. Place is a lot like sites or location within LEED. But there are some nuances within LBC that they capture more directly that is different from other standards, and that includes equity. They do talk about health, but they also talk about happiness as well as beauty. So they care just as much about the functionality as they do about the aesthetic. And again, they're not looking at just reduction, they're looking at net positive. So honing in on water and the energy imperatives, they want to not only get to net zero energy, they want buildings that are giving back energy more than they are using. They want to give back cleaner, more water than they are actually using. They want to have net material, zero positive waste. So this obviously is, above and beyond any of the standards that we've talked about so far. Because of that, it is quite challenging, but that's why it's called the Living Building Challenge. But it's also it's possible. You just need the right guidance and the right resources, and also the right policies and codes in place that allow for some of these imperatives to happen. One of the other facets that is really important to LBC are materials health and building health itself and wellness. That, again, is something that is resonating a lot in today's world. And I'll wrap it up there and turn it back over to Emily to focus a little bit more on a standard that talks holistically about wellness.
All right, I almost forgot to unmute and fell victim to the 2020 curse of you're on mute. Yeah, so I want to talk about WELL to wrap up the discussion. WELL is a lot like the Living Building Challenge in that it goes above and beyond the three previous standards that we spoke about, which are a lot focused on energy and things like that. But this takes it another level to focus on the well-being of the people. You may have seen recent ads for the WELL Health and Safety Seal. I actually saw one during the Super Bowl. Lady Gaga and J-Lo and a couple other celebrities were on it, and that is something that they've been advertising a lot due to the pandemic. It's not the full-blown standard, but it is parts that are related to keeping us all safe and healthy, I guess, hence the name. I'm going to speak about the overall standard. So WELL combines the best practices in design and construction with evidence-based health and scientific research. They harness buildings as vehicles to support human health and well-being. And WELL is the first building standard to focus exclusively on human health and wellness, which you'll see as I mentioned some of the items that they incorporated. Their statement is that WELL certified spaces are designed to improve the nutrition, fitness, mood, sleep patterns, productivity, and performance for the people working, living, shopping, or playing inside of them. I saw a presentation about WELL a couple years ago, and I just thought it was amazing. So I was pretty excited this year. WELL started to, in 2020, WELL started to hit the headlines due to the pandemic, and KCI asked me to get more involved, and I was more than happy to do it. So the largest cost to a building is the personnel. If you consider the life cycle of a building over 30 years, personnel costs significantly outweigh any of the other building and operational costs. And WELL quotes a study that says that personnel accounts for 92% of the cost. So by introducing WELL into the buildings, you have the potential to reduce personnel costs, health, medical, and productivity costs in the long run. The long-term value can be generated by addressing health in both commercial and residential spaces. And next slide. So WELL has 3 standard project types right now, and you can see below that they're working on 6 other pilot programs to help expand the reach of this rating system. Next slide. Okay, so the WELL Building Standard has 7 concepts, which are listed here. These are very aligned with the goals of the other rating systems, but they take those goals to the next level. Each of these are tied to specific body systems, which which is not something a mechanical engineer usually knows a lot, but the standard considers effects on the cardiovascular, digestive, endocrine, immune, integumentary, muscular, nervous, reproductive, respiratory, skeletal, and urinary systems. So it's very comprehensive. That's the body. That's all of them. The way that I sum up well is that it wants to make all the things that make you happy and healthy more accessible. It includes having healthier options more prominent, such as having stairways and drinking fountains more visible and easy to access than the elevator and the soda vending machine. Years ago, I had a bunch of doctors in one medical office building, and when you walked in, the elevators were right in front of you and the stairs were nowhere to be found. And it drove me nuts because I had a doctor on the second floor and I had to wait. I really liked, they mentioned keeping the stairways prominent or making a feature stair and encouraging people to use it. So when there's food in the building, healthy food options are to be promoted, as well as smaller portion sizes, clear labeling of ingredients, specifically those that are artificial or known allergens. They have credits or features relating to flexible workstations, to have a mix of standing and seated options, places you can move throughout the day just to keep yourself comfortable and awake and happy and healthy. If you have to travel for work, there are guidelines about how much comp time you should receive. If you're going to be out of town for an extended period of time, there's a provision for travel home at certain intervals. And that's all goes into the mind concept to keep your mind healthy. They encourage family leave time, charitable involvement. They encourage support for healthy sleep, such as a policy of no work after midnight for non-shift work. Fitness features include providing the means and the incentive for workers to stay physically active, and that includes just having places in the building or around the building that they can easily move about during the day. You can set up kind of guided activities, have fitness classes. There's 100 features in the standard, but these are some of my favorites that will help you get a good understanding of what the standard involves. If you look into the different rating systems, there's a lot of things in here that will kind of remind you of LEED, and they do have I believe it's called a crosswalk document. So this can be married up with LEED to achieve kind of mutual goals. Next slide. So yeah, just to wrap up our presentation, this is kind of a visual summary of the best practices that we've been talking about over the 5 rating systems. You've heard references to all of them, and this is it. These are our best practices. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Leah and Emily. This is a great presentation, and for sharing the different rating systems. We basically at this point we have about 15 minutes left in the hour, and we wanted to open it up to question and answer. And again, if you have questions, please type them in the question and answer box. We have a few, so we can get started on some, but we have time if you think of other questions and you'd like to add to the discussion. So I guess actually the first question that came up is more about residential, and I know this is not a residential presentation, and perhaps we'll have a future green home construction presentation or something similar to that. But I was just kind of, I was just kind of curious, like out of the rating systems that we talked about today, do any of those have residential components? I mean, we talked about commercial exclusively, but maybe this is an opportunity to describe some of the residential components.
Yeah, there is a LEED for Homes rating system. Passive house, although Leah mentioned it's not specifically only for houses. And for those in the Harrisburg area, the new PHFA building was built to passive house standards, although I don't believe they achieved certification. And so things can be retrofitted. But yeah, there are opportunities with that. The small first steps that anyone can take is, when we moved into this house, well, it's been 9 years now, but MedEd, our electrical provider, offered to send us a box, and it had, at that time, I think the first time they sent us one, it was CFLs. Now they've sent LED lights, different things you can, and they'll send it to you for free. A thing to put on our filter in our air handling unit to let us know whenever you needed to change the filter, because if the more the dirtier your filter is, the more fan power you're using to push the air through your house. It becomes less efficient. So that's an easy first step that anyone could take. I'm not sure if Leah has any other suggestions that are easy, but that's my easy thing. Or even, obviously, you can change them out yourselves. You can buy new light bulbs or things anywhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really great. And I'll just add on to that and say that within all of these standards, there are residential options as well. We didn't necessarily go into those today, but something that maybe we didn't talk about a lot was that just because you don't achieve certification, so you don't have to go all the way through and earn all the points so that you can get a badge that says that your building is certified. If you're a homeowner or a building owner and you want to just comb through some of the resources that we'll provide afterwards that will have links to all of these different programs, you can cherry pick the ones that seem interesting and that seem applicable to you, so that maybe your home will have passive house features, or maybe your home will have living building, GreenGovs, or LEED or WELL features without necessarily ever going through to full certification. So that's one thing, is you could always take a look on your own. As far as taking advantage of some of the opportunities within your own home outside of that, I think utilizing passive principles makes a lot of sense. So if you are, cold, warm, is there a way that you can not have the energy on, but just open up a window? I think sometimes it's about the inaction that we do as much as the action that we do. When you're brushing your teeth or running the water, or washing something, can you stop the water from running while you finish your task? Is there a way that you can take advantage of natural daylight instead of having your lights on? Can you rearrange your room in such a way so that your office, your desk, your tables by a window with natural lighting instead of in a corner where you might have to use lighting? So those are all ways that you can very easily and affordably change your options without necessarily having to go out and completely change your home. Now, the more technical and involved that you want to get, that is where it might get more costly, and it might be fully worth it for you to do. But yeah, lots of other things you could do, but I would say those are some of my top tips.
Sounds great. And there's a number of questions that have come in now, and we'll just keep going through here until the end of the hour here. But this next question I like this one. Is there widely accepted consensus policy literature on whether it's sustainable to renovate, upgrade old infrastructure versus demolishing and rebuilding? It's kind of like it's a question for the ages, I think, and I'm just kind of curious what your opinions are of that.
Yeah, I can start, and then Emily, if you want to add on. But the most sustainable building is the one that is already built. And that is because you are starting out with base materials. And obviously there will always be caveats where maybe in some instances it does make sense to tear down and build new. But in most instances, having something that's already existing is going to mean that you have infrastructure and materials to work with. So that's raw virgin material that you are not having to go out and purchase and excavate and consume. It's also not, when you think about not just the building, but everything that makes that building operate, electric wires and cables and pipes, if that's already in the ground and set up with the local infrastructure, that's ground that you don't need to dig up and, again, excavate and damage. So it's much easier, not easier, but it's much better and more sustainable to use an existing building. Lucky for us on the East Coast, we have a lot of existing infrastructure. So we look at, fit outs and retrofits as an important part of electrifying our grid and making our buildings greener. So I don't know if you want to add on to that, Emily.
No, I mean, I think you said it. Obviously, each individual project or building is a unique case, but overall, yeah, the most sustainable building is the one that's already built. Just think of how long ago that carbon was embodied, you know, in a 100 or 200-year-old building. We're way past that. So yeah.
Yep, definitely. So the next question, this goes back to the, it always comes down to the cost. What are the costs of these programs? They're all great rating systems, but I guess what's the cost breakdowns the best that you guys can offer?
I assumed that this was referring to the cost to implement them, but maybe this is the cost to, well, because I read it before you read it up. But yeah, now I'm wondering, I mean, the cost of actually doing each of the programs varies. And for instance, you can go through LEED, you can find that online, you could go through all of it and not pay a cent, you could just follow it. But if you actually want the certification, then you have to pay. I honestly am not familiar with what any of these cost. I apologize for that, but yeah, any of these you could do. If you don't want the certification, they're free. You could do all the things just for the good of doing them.
Okay. So another question is, how do you reconcile tight building construction initiatives for energy conservation with maintaining proper indoor air quality, pathogens, fumes, moisture, etc.?
Like, I can tell you that this has come a long way. When the buildings first started tightening up, this wasn't necessarily addressed, and many years ago, we definitely dealt with some issues. We had built some identical buildings a few years later, and they went LEED, and it used a different HVAC system than the original buildings. And there were humidity issues, stuffiness, and then the floor that had the laundry room on, oh my goodness, yeah, it was a nightmare. But all of these, and like Leah mentioned in the in Passive House, which is a very tight envelope, it's built in that you need to design your HVAC system a certain way so that you are getting the amount of fresh air and air exchanges that you need, so that it's not humid. Yeah, you're not any of these things that were mentioned, the pathogens, fumes, moisture. So that's all exchanged out of the building, and all of the rating systems address that in one way or another. But Passive House is the one I think of most specifically because of how tight it is.
Yeah, and I'll add on to that too and say that one of the key components with that too is making sure that you're having healthy materials. So the indoor air quality is really going to be determined by the ventilation flow, but also if you're having your carpets, your glues, your paints, your molding, etc., that is going to off gas at a certain rate. And so you can actually buy materials that are low toxin, no toxin, low VOC or volatile organic compounds, so low VOC or no VOC, so that way you will not have as much off-gassing, and that air ventilation is going to, get that much more fresh air into the space.
Okay. Do these certification programs incentivize the use of local materials like hemp and hardwoods?
Emily, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe some of the standards like LEED have a materials component that if it's locally sourced within a certain number of miles. So Emily went through some of the categories, and if you're really interested, you can go into the weeds a bit and go into each of these resources, but there are different points, and each point will have a definition around what that actually means. But I believe a couple of the points under the materials and waste category deal with locally sourcing and where and how long it's traveling to get to you.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. That is definitely part of the LEED standard and part of the others as well. Yeah, they'll have a certain radius from the project site where things need to be sourced, manufactured. Yeah, different options. But yes, there definitely is incentive to use local materials, and both stimulates the local economy, but then it also, you're not wasting a bunch of creating a bunch of greenhouse gases with transportation and shipping.
Okay. And another question, this is a big question. What are some of the challenges in convincing owners to design and build these types of high-performing buildings?
Emily, do you want to take that?
I was going to say cost is the main one. It's always, because I mean, and you can't blame people. Most of us aren't wealthy enough to just do things for fun or for the good of the world. You have a bottom line you have to meet. Often, especially as someone who's in control of the mechanical system, which is a huge energy use, we're able to sometimes convince with payback periods. But yeah, it definitely is a concern and a challenge for this. I don't know if you have anything to add, Leah.
Yeah, I think cost can be a barrier. It is important to keep in mind that in a lot of instances, the payback in the long run will actually save buildings money. So when you're trying to convince owners, it's about having them see that cost benefit analysis and knowing that sometimes, especially in a retrofit and not new construction, but sometimes in just a couple years, you'll start seeing payback on more energy efficiency. And in some cases, it's required. So I think someone later had asked, can they require the municipality to have LEED, green globes, et cetera, in new construction? And some places do. There are some cities that require that to be part of baseline or equivalent to their code. And we're getting there as a state where we are starting to think about increasing code to a level where it's starting to meet some of these baseline requirements for a standard. So the idea is you can increase code, the standards can increase, and you'll continually rise to the challenge. So yes, there is a possibility that we can get it mandated at some point. But until then, right now, the best we can do is incentivize by, and some places also do incentives. So it's not required, but you might be able to have stretches beyond your code, beyond codes when it comes to height and size and space, et cetera, so that you are rewarded for choosing a standard like LEED.
Yeah, one of my board members for USGBC works on this type of thing for the city of Harrisburg. And I know Baltimore years ago, I mean, a bigger city, not just, for instance, York Township where I live, but they have requirements in place. So yeah, like Leah said, it's coming. Just got to keep working and keep asking the questions and mention it to the people in charge. They know that it matters.
Yeah, and this one's, I guess, related. This question is, are there incentives currently available for folks to use climate-friendly building materials? Or I guess we didn't, what are the incentives, if there are any at all? Financial incentives.
Yeah, again, I think that it really just depends on where you live and what you're doing exactly. There will always be a financial incentive when you are personally doing energy savings. So maybe that won't be the upfront cost, but it will be the long-term gain of saving money on having your utility bills be lower when it comes to your energy bill, your water bill, even your health bills. We're having a lot of links right now to indoor environmental quality and materials health and building health and healthcare costs, and helping address some of the chronic illnesses that are pervasive in a lot of our communities. So it's about tackling both health and energy from the same lens, and that alone is a long-term incentive.
Yeah, but for any particular municipality or even at the state level, I think a Google search or a call to your local rep is the best way to try to get in touch with us. I'm seeing this question was referring to an example of pouring concrete footers. So yeah, there's all kinds of things out there. And so yeah, you would need to, I don't know of any specifically, but if you reach out to your whatever level of government you're interested in speaking to, someone should be able to help you. And again, as with getting municipalities to require these certifications, the more people mention these things to them, the more that they'll understand that it's important to people, and then things progress and the incentives may be offered in the future.
Mm-hmm.
And we actually are at 2:00 right now, and there's still several questions. I didn't know if there's anything else you wanted to address before we move into sort of the closing.
I'd
If
love
not-
to quickly address one
Okay.
of the last questions that came from someone named Neil about, when you're buying new appliances or when you're creating these new fit outs or renovating or building new, is the transportation, the creation of those products, are the greenhouse gases associated with that calculated within the greenhouse gas emission total of the building? And yes, so we talked a lot today about energy and like the usage of buildings, electricity use and hot water, et cetera. That's known as the operational energy use of a building. However, Emily had mentioned the embodied carbon or the embodied footprint of the building itself. So that's all the energy that it took to get that building to be where it is that day. So the materials, the transportation costs, the labor, all of that will have a carbon footprint. So that's part of the building's carbon footprint. And then there's the operations. And so it's really important to be looking at both, which circles back to why an existing building is really the most sustainable building that we have, because that embodied carbon is already there. You're not creating any new embodied carbon. So yes, it should be factored into the calculation.
Okay. Thanks, Emily and Leah. And I think this was a really great presentation. Appreciate your insight into green buildings today. I just want to wrap it up and I guess apologize for some of the folks on the attendees that with maybe there was some technical difficulties going on, and we will work on some of that for next time. But for those that may have missed part of the presentation, we will be posting the entire presentation online on the GreenGov website, and we'll send an email notification next week to everyone notifying you when it's available to view. And so we also hope that you join us for the next webinar, which is April 9th, on climate action plans for institutions, and it'll be presented by DEP Secretary McDonald. And hope you will join, and thanks all and have a great weekend.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having us.